33. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for coming. And yeah, does anybody want to open us up in just a word of prayer? Yeah.
Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this Holy Shabbat day, and we thank you for the opportunity to bring honor and glory to you in our singing and our dancing and the message that you gave us earlier this morning. And we just praise you and for your Son, Messiah Yeshua. We ask for your presence here this afternoon as we learn more about the kingdom that comes. Elizabeth and others here, you have said where there are two or three gathered in your name, there you will be also. And we thank you for your presence, and we look forward to hearing your knowledge and wisdom, we pray. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, so this is the first slide. Do any of you, I'm seeing some new faces, so I'm sure not everybody is aware where we left off. Can somebody tell us where we left off? Anybody remember the assignment given over the holidays? All right, let me ask, did anybody come with anything prepared for sharing? I sent out a couple emails about that, or maybe one or two.
So
Yeah.
were we supposed to look at these 5 areas and look and see where the kingdom that come is mentioned in these?
Not where the kingdom come. Just a general compare and contrast the different repetitions from each of the covenants, as whatever God says in Genesis, He repeats in Noah with the covenant with Noah. And I gave an example last time. Remember with the food, God tells Adam and Eve that they can eat of every tree and green thing in Genesis. And then He repeats that. You see that repeated in Noah, with Noah, except with Noah He says you may eat of the animals, except blood. Except you cannot you cannot eat the blood. So that was an example to show. Let's go through, and then you see, of course, those rules and regulations even more specified and even more developed in Moses' time with the Torah, with kosher foods, unkosher, very much more specifically given. So that was an example of just read the different covenants, compare and contrast what is repeated, what is different, how is something like the commandment for what food to eat, how is it repeated, how is it developed even further. That's the idea of the ripple, right? The ripple effect with all sorts of images, promises, person, story, narratives, right? These ripple effects that take place. God gives a promise and then He develops it with each new covenant. It just expands and expands and it grows and grows, but it's also recycled, right? You see these repetitions and these recycling, this echoing back to the original, but then it continues even into the new covenant. So that was the holiday homework. But it's okay. I figured that perhaps it was a little bit of a late notice where I sent out that email. So I will make some room and some space in the future, mainly next lesson, not next week, but the next one, because we meet every other week. So I'll leave some room in the next lesson for you guys to share whatever findings you had.
Okay.
Yeah.
I became distracted by the role of the women, just as we spent a lot of time with the piano, but I got distracted with the story of Ruth and Naomi, and how Naomi and her family left Judah to get away from the famine. And they all died in Moab, the sons and the husband. And then she comes back to Bethlehem. And we know Bethlehem plays a very, very big role. And it reminded me of an echo of the resurrection of the dead. In other words, her family was gone, but it was restored through what happened to Naomi when she returned. And Ruth was a vehicle for that restoration.
Yeah.
Just in the way that you might say Miriam was a vehicle for the restoration
Well,
to this.
I know Boaz gets called the redeemer technically in the story, but Ruth and Boaz are the redeemers,
Yeah.
right? They redeem Naomi's situation. They redeem her inheritance, you know, in
And
that
they
way.
bring the Davidic covenant into.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, because, what is it, Ruth gives birth to, she names Boaz,
Mhm.
and they give Obed, and then
Yep.
it gives to Jesse, and
Yep.
Jesse to David, and so.
Yep. The Messianic line.
Yeah, it's a ripple, yeah.
Yeah.
But it makes the Davidic covenant come alive because for all practical purposes, it wasn't there.
Yeah.
I mean, all of her offspring in Moab.
Well, so the Davidic line was prophesied even earlier than that. Genesis 49.
Yeah.
Remember what Genesis, when Jacob is blessing his sons?
Right.
What does he say of Judah?
Yeah, the crown or the throne
Yeah.
never be
Yeah.
put in.
Yeah. So it really starts as, I mean, we could even talk about it even earlier, but that's the seed like, right? And then that's another good analogy to talk about these ripples. We're talking about God plants a seed, whether it's a metaphor, a promise, a person, a story, even entire narratives like we talked about, like Hannah and her narrative and David's narrative, and Messiah steps into, you know, he is like David, he's like Joseph. So he plants a seed, and then that seed grows and grows and grows. That's another good analogy for understanding how these images and motifs and patterns and literary devices is what we're talking about of the scripture, of how the authors are actually intentionally trying to point out these devices and show us and take us on this journey where we can see these connections and these developments. And how they connect into the New Testament. And so okay, where's my... So this is, I want us to go ahead and this is gonna be the review page, okay? This is what we talked about last time. This is really kind of the slide where we left off. I've changed it a little bit, but here you can see, and hopefully this will jog your memory. We saw initially, we left off in 2 Samuel 7, right, which is the Davidic covenant. God establishes his covenant with David there, and he gives him all sorts of promises. But we saw there how the Davidic covenant builds upon the Abrahamic promises that we see in Genesis 12 and 15, right? Promises which even then in Genesis 12 and 15 were recycled from Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 through 3, okay? So since the beginning, we traced 3 key promises, okay? 3 key promises that we see God recycling and developing with each new covenant that he establishes. So the first one, the promise of a seed, okay? Seed, descendants, offspring, nation, we can have many words here. And you see in the first one, I wish I had a laser here, but I don't. So with Adam and Eve, God says, be fruitful and multiply, okay? For offspring. And then the Abrahamic covenant, you see that showing up again with God promising Abraham offspring as many as the stars, okay? As the stars in the heaven and as the grains in the sand, okay? And we see that promise for Abraham actually being fulfilled by the time of Moses, with the Mosaic covenant, right? That is when Israel actually becomes a nation, because they multiply in Egypt, and then they gain their independence with the Exodus, right? They become autonomous and independent, and they officially establish themselves as a nation. But then we see that promise, continue, that seed continue to develop with David in the Davidic covenant, where God promises David a house, a dynasty, right? Just like Adam was told to multiply, and also Abraham was promised a nation through his seed. And then the second one, we see this promise for land, okay, or dominion, okay? And back in Genesis 1, we see Eden, okay? Eden is the place of dominion. Let me see where I wrote this. No, I wrote a note here. Okay, so Eden was actually where, okay, so, sorry. So Eden was the bigger place, right? But God planted the garden east of Eden, okay? So even with Adam and Eve, you see God placing Adam and Eve and giving them dominion over like that place, that particular place. So he gives land, basically, right? And then you see that recycled, obviously, with Abraham and the promise that he will give him land, the land of Canaan, and that, again, keep in mind, is a place of dominion, okay? And again, we see most of the Abrahamic covenant promises, most of these three themes, we see them fulfilled in a huge way, in a really milestone way with Moses and the Mosaic covenant. So the land of Israel basically is, when they step into the land, they conquer the land. The tribes inherit their portions with Moses and Joshua. And so the land of Israel becomes God's rule through God's people, okay? And then you see that continually developing through the Davidic covenant with the promise of a throne, okay? God would gift David with a throne, which is a place of dominion, a place of rule. And if you keep in mind, David was the one to capture Jerusalem and make it the seat of Israel's rule, right? Which again builds on that dominion aspect that God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden. And that's where I have my notes that I meant to say, because it was part of Eden. Genesis 2:8 says that God planted the garden east of Eden. So again, another section of a greater. And I mentioned that because it's important to see how, the garden and the land of Israel are very connected because they are God's place for ruling the rest of the nations, the rest of the world, okay? The garden was this capital of Eden in a way. Israel is going to be the capital where Yeshua reigns from Jerusalem, all the world, okay? So that's where I was trying to point that out and show you how that seed really continues to grow and grow. I just kind of gave it away more, but it's okay. And so, of course, God's promise of a throne to David, it also naturally we see that it recycles the land promise that he gave Abraham. And it also made good on the promise of a throne, the promise of the throne makes good on the prophetic promise that I just said, given in Genesis 49, that the scepter will not depart from Judah, okay? And this is a prophecy of kings and thrones and dominion, okay? So this idea of dominion, and I have the last one here, with the new covenant, you see the idea going back to number 1, seed, right, and offspring develop, since Genesis, it develops in the new covenant, the children of God. Who are the children of God now? Jews and Gentiles, one in Messiah, okay? See this development, it's much more developed, but it's still recycled, given all the way back from Adam and Eve into Abraham, and then with the idea of land, okay? God's rule will be restored to all the earth, as I just said, with Jerusalem as its capital. So that is the bigger picture development, the fruit of that seed given all the way back in Genesis with Adam and Eve for a place of dominion. God's rule through God's people. God doesn't rule this earth directly by himself. He has appointed us as co-rulers, co-creators, co-regents, right? To rule, to represent his rule, and to rule on his behalf. Okay, and that's partly what was stolen from us in the fall. We gave up that rule, that dominion to Hasatan, and that's part of what we regain in Yeshua, in Messiah. We regain that rule and that dominion, and we can then produce the culture and the rule of God on the rest of this earth. And so the new covenant foresees a time when all the earth will be restored under God's rule. And we will be ruling, and Yeshua will be ruling from Jerusalem, which makes good on the Davidic covenant of the promise of a throne. So anyway, and then the third one we looked at, this one was a little bit more harder to trace a little. Do you guys remember the proto-evangelium, Genesis 3:15? That's the first hint of the gospel, where we see this image of a head-crushing seed that will arise from the woman that will crush the head of the serpent. Okay, this is considered by scholars the first hint of the gospel, the very first mention of the gospel in the scriptures. So this idea of okay, so you have that first seed mention of the good news, and then you have it repeated with Abraham, right? In Genesis 12, where Abraham is promised that all the families of the earth will be blessed through him and his offspring. Okay, that's good news. There's blessing for the nations, for everybody. And again, as with the other two, this blessing is really realized. It reaches a momentous fulfillment in Moses with the Mosaic covenant, with the giving of the Torah specifically. Okay, because there we see that God has set apart the nation of Israel as a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? They intercede, right, between God and others. So they're there in the middle, okay? So the good news function of being a kingdom of priests is that they are now a light to the nations. And they specifically, that light that Israel gave to the nations in their time and during that dispensation was the Torah, okay? It was because the Torah is a tree of life, okay? What did Israel give to the nations? They gave them knowledge of the Most High God, of the one true God, one God, okay? We live today in mostly a monotheistic world because of Israel's influence, because of Israel's, spreading, giving us the 10 Commandments, okay? The pillars of the justice system and the law, right? And we are benefiting today in America because our founding fathers based most of their, the Constitution and the idea of rights and America on these principles, okay? So just Israel served as a huge light to the nations. And we see that also this so in the Davidic covenant with David, right, the nature of this kingdom that gives blessing to the nations is further developed when God says to David that this will be a kingdom that will last forever. Okay, so it's interesting, it's more developed in that the idea of kingdom gets an eternal aspect to it, okay? It becomes eternal. Okay, when God says your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, right? And that gets picked up actually even further developed in the book of Daniel, which we will talk about shortly here. But basically Daniel's vision builds upon God's promise to David, specifically here about an eternal kingdom and a son of man whose dominion is everlasting and it will never pass away, and his kingdom will be one that's never destroyed. So with David specifically this, and he says, this is good news actually for all the earth, because we talked about last time, if you remember, 2 Samuel 7:19 says, when God gives all these promises to David, and David responds, he says, you have spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come, and this is instruction for all mankind. Okay, so there's this, again, that good news, theme is being recycled here and developed even further in this idea of an eternal kingdom that will bless all mankind. So even though David united the kingdoms, right? But even his united kingdom was divided eventually and torn asunder. But there was this promise of a kingdom that would endure forever. And that the one who would bring such an enduring kingdom would arise from David's own offspring. Okay, so that good news of an eternal kingdom would not only bless Israel, but all the nations, as we said. And that again echoes, you can hear God's promise to Abraham, and that all the families of the earth will be blessed, and it goes right back to that seed of the first hint of the gospel. the one who will make that happen. And finally, we see the even greater fulfillment of Adam and Eve and Abraham and David and Moses in the new covenant. With this theme really gets developed with the good news of the arrival of the kingdom of God in Messiah, who is the king. And the kingdom of God has arrived, and even the specific eternal nature of the kingdom has arrived when the king arrives. Okay, so that is what we are about to embark on in part 2 of the Kingdom Come study. Yes. But, so I hope that kind of jogged your memory, and that hopefully that was good enough review to remind us all of where we left off. Did anybody have any comments or anything that they wanted to add or share? Linda, of course. Of course. I love it.
I may not be able to address this, but I've been following the dispossession of different people. Lot seems to lose his space. When he separates himself from Abraham, he moves to Sodom and Gomorrah, wherever it may be. And of course, Esau lost his space. And as you go, as they enter the land, there are all of these different people who lose their space. This dispossession of the land. Even if you go back to the Tower of Babel, he sends the people throughout all the earth. Okay? But then they are not in possession of the land. It's like temporary holding until he creates this covenant. And it's the covenant possession. It's like title to your house instead of just renting. And you might say that a lot of these people were renting space, but only in the covenant do they actually have a right to the land. And I was wondering if, in addressing that, if you had come across some of that, the dispossessed, as it were. Because I know just from history, we talked about people coming into other people, where other people live, and then dispossessing them, and then establishing, and then becoming dispossessed. The thing with Daniel, he sees, okay, you have Babylon as the head, and then it's displaced by Media Persia, displaced by Greece, and then displaced by Rome, displaced by who knows who and what. So there's another system about the dispossessed that's going alongside the same thing.
So this is a good example of what, I had in mind to give you guys to do. Like, if this particular theme is on your heart and you want to look into further, go dig and trace the beginning of where you see these where God dispossesses these nations, and people losing, their inheritance, and because I feel like there's so many layers to that, Sometimes it's the sins of that nation have piled, and God's like, time's up. My judgment is bringing another nation to dispossess you and to give them that land. That's the case of the Canaanites, actually. Israel is God's hand of judgment because their sins have piled, and God's like, okay, judgment day has arrived. You see other cases where, Esau, and even at the Tower of Babel, the nations lose their inheritance, and God scatters them. That's biblical punishment that you see over and over again, even with Israel, right? The scattering. Lot is interesting because he separates from Abraham. His descendants are the Moabites, right? Lot is the descendant of the Moabite because his daughter is so. Interesting. That's interesting. I wonder how much that's a redemption on Lot and his heritage. His departure, and Ruth is a return almost. That's that's a redemption to Lot and his story. Back into he's back into the family in that way. It's interesting. So that's a great example of what I want to do. Next time, I'm going to, set apart some time for you guys to talk. And whatever, themes or motifs or images you're interested in, what catches your eye, I want you guys to, trace that, just do, it doesn't have to be in-depth, research, and you don't have to go into all these scholarly sources, just in the Bible itself, read and trace that for yourself, and I don't know, share your thoughts. Yes, what's your name?
Gregory.
Gregory?
Yeah.
Nice to meet
So
you.
you were talking about seeds and so on and these prophecies, and the thought occurred to me while you were saying this is that God did not have to use all the bloodlines to hit the Mary. In other words, he could have planted the seed in her and the Messiah had been born, but what's interesting is that from Genesis 3, he says, there's going to be a seed, and this is going to be hundreds of years later,
Yeah.
if not thousands.
Mm.
But and he, through all these different abrahamic and different covenants between, all that was maintained through those, even some that came out ends up coming back in. And so his prophecies are true, but also, you know, as much as Satan has tried, he cannot destroy that bloodline.
Hmm. Yeah. I think I'm understanding what you're saying. I'm not quite sure though. But what do you mean by bloodline specifically? I think that word threw me off.
Well, the seed, you're talking about a seed.
Oh,
There has to
I
be a
see.
bloodline
Oh, okay.
to connect those dots.
Okay,
All the
I see.
way from Old Testament to New.
Yes.
And so through Abraham, through Isaac, Jacob, David.
Yes.
I mean, all
Yeah,
of
yeah,
this
yeah.
was maintained by the Godhead. I mean, even when, you know, you had different people who weren't of the bloodline who ended up coming in and restoring these
Yeah.
things. I mean,
Yeah. Huh, okay.
that's prophetic in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and that actually goes back to the Tower of Babel because that's when God decided to, the nations wanted to create a name for themselves. That was what the building of the tower really symbolized. That was the message they were communicating to God. We're going to build a name for ourselves. And God comes along and said, no, I'm going to build a name for myself. You know, and basically what happens at the Tower of Babel is he disinherits the nations, you know, from their cooperation in his plan for the redemption of the world and the restoration, right? And what he does is, okay, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to raise up another nation, a seed, a bloodline, right? This and these promises are then repeated, and you see the plan of God, the redemption of God unfolding through this line, through the seed, through the offspring, through the nation, right? Which eventually brings back all the nations that were disinherited from the Tower of Babel. Wow. And it's just such a beautiful picture to like, and you know, God is a gardener, okay? So we've got to be, anybody know the first thing about gardening, right? You got to be patient, okay? Because it is a slow process and growth, right? You plant a seed, it's like nothing happens. And that's what Abraham lived, right? It's like, God, you gave me this promise, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he doesn't even see the first bud, okay? Until much later, right? Finally, Isaac is the first bud, but we know what happens in the meantime, right? God's like, okay, I'm going to make your promise happen, right? And so the whole situation with Hagar happens, and God's, I guess this is how the Lord is going to make good on his promises, right? By our involvement and our plan B. Anyway.
Yeah, just a short comment on that. That just because he makes you a nation doesn't necessarily mean that you will be possessing where he put you. It's a temporary thing at best, it seems, because Hagar was assured that her son would become
A nation himself too.
Okay, but that did not mean that it had this particular covenantal thing that's promised that he gave.
It didn't have, yes, because the promised was through the promised son. And Ishmael was not the promised son. Because that was not God's way. That was not his plan from the beginning. That was man's plan to make God's plan happen. So.
The only thing that came out of that, he said that his Austin would be like the stars
And the sand, yeah.
So he got that part came out of all of that.
Yeah. Good.
I didn't hear what you said.
I was just saying, what came out of that was, is that his descendants were like the sand of the sea.
Right.
Regardless, there were some that had the covenant and some that didn't.
All right, so I want to know ahead of time, does anybody or will anybody for not next weekend, but the next weekend, so you got 2 weeks, if I create that space for you guys to share whatever, themes, whatever you're picking up on, whatever you're tracing, whether it's repetitions or development, it's going to be both, really. How many of you want that space to share in 2 weeks?
A little bit.
Linda? Okay. Okay, let me, sorry, I need to write this down.
Jerry, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, Andy? Anybody else? And you can have as much time as you want, honestly, because I can always adjust around that, so. Do any of you have an idea what you want to share, or do you want to just surprise us?
I like to follow the theme of the dispossessed.
The dispossessing, okay. Okay. Gary?
Gary?
Oh, did you have one? Did you want to share?
Well, just picking up on Linda said the dispossessed, and then I'd like to talk a little bit how they're brought back in. Because I recall that one of the groups was dispossessed for 12 generations, and then they were redeemed. And I'd like to see how that
Interesting.
ties in.
Which group? I'm curious.
I can't remember right offhand.
Okay.
I need to do the research, but I remember there was one that was cast out, and then for 12 generations, and then.
Well, the whites were part of that.
Yeah.
It's a curse on them that they could not be part of the people of
That's
Israel
what
for a period of time. We'll work on this together.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. All right, yeah. You guys can have double time. You can share individually, you can share together, whatever. Andy, did you have a?
Yeah, I missed several of these, so maybe I missed, and you've already talked about it, but the relationship between, chosen people and, Tower of Babel, I never realized it, I never seen it like that. Did you talk about that before?
Yes, I've talked, I feel like I brought that up in a lot of sessions.
Okay.
Here's what I'm gonna do, and I was actually wanted you to do that. I don't know if I sent you an email all last night, but I am going to send you again, if I haven't already, a link to all the kingdom studies, all the kingdom recordings that I have on my channel, on my playlist. So if you go to my channel, Messianic Matters, you click on the category that says playlist, okay? There will be all these different options, and one of them is Kingdom Come. That's this study. And you will access all the recordings that I have recorded for this study. And they are in order from the most recent to the oldest. So the most recent on top, the oldest on the bottom. And what will be particularly helpful for you, actually I have to double check this. I think it's the last lesson. Is it? Maybe the last 2 lessons that I gave, because I'm trying to figure out, whenever we talked about David's prophecy, his messianic prophecy in the words that he speaks to Goliath, and he talks about all Israel, or all this assembly, and also all the world. He talks about 2 groups, and he prophesizes, like, basically New Testament times, and he prophesizes messianic expectations of what the Son of David will do in bringing back all Israel and the nations. And I talk about the Tower of Babel in that one a lot. So I'll go back and look at it for you specifically, which ones would be most relevant.
Some of my ideas might just be, we call it development, it's extrapolation. I mean, since you've already talked about it, I've just been thinking about this and finding stuff in the New Testament, which has kind of been eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
It may or may not be tied to your kingdom.
No, it doesn't have to be tied to the kingdom. Well, eventually, whatever you guys, let me tell you, whatever you decide, it's going to have kingdom implications. I'm telling you, because the kingdom is the biggest big picture of the whole Bible. It's going to fit somewhere, okay? So, but don't think that you have to like make it, you know, like attached to the kingdom. It's going to have a section of in the story of God's redemption, okay? It will have a role. So you don't have to figure that out. Just pick a theme, pick an image, pick a narrative, pick a person that you like, you know, and trace their story, trace that theme as far as you can get. If you can make it to the New Testament, great, because all these themes, all these motifs, all these patterns, they get fulfilled and engulfed in the New Testament, okay, in the person of Yeshua. So I want us to like just be able to trace that and to see how the scriptures, you know, actually testify from the law, from Moses to the prophets about Yeshua, just as he said, right? These scriptures, they testify about me, they point to me. Linda, you had a comment?
No, I changed my mind.
Okay. Good. Okay, I just made a note. Jerry, did you want to share too?
No, I've been teaching you about a lot of things that you started. You just helped to bring it out even more. Part of it, I think, is a lesson for everybody. They need to learn what I learned. That a lot of the characters, when you read all this about the Torah, you see Adam and Eve and all these, a lot of these characters. You see a repeated theme. Because the Father's trying to take everybody back to the garden to see something. It's a lot deeper, which I'm trying to work on teaching people about the garden story. Most people need to really go back to the garden, because everything points back to that. That sin is something that happened in the garden is more deeper than what most people even think about.
Yeah. You know, and you actually, I thought of this one this morning, and you just reminded me. I was thinking how, because I was listening to someone about, they were talking about how Sarah was the one to suggest to Abraham, hey, let's do this differently, right?
Yeah.
You have a baby by Hagar, okay? That's a flash, we've seen that before. Yes!
Yes.
With Eve suggesting, making that
That's how they
suggestion
teach you
to eating of the sin, yeah.
They see the repeated, the sin that has to be redeemed is in the garden, happened in the garden.
Yeah.
But
And
I'm going to work with you, Rich, and everybody to understand what the garden story is telling you.
Yeah.
There's more to it than what most people.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And that's why I suggested Bible Project, because Bible Project does a really good job at bringing out these big story movements of text.
What feast is coming that you see Eve, Adam and Eve in?
Huh?
What feast is coming that you see Adam and Eve in? It's a feast
Tell us.
coming that's right in front of you.
Passover,
No. Before then,
Feast of Unleavened Bread. Oh.
Esther.
Okay. Well, do you want a platform in 2 weeks to share that?
If I can, because I'm tied up with a lot of things.
Okay.
The characters in there are pictures of the Father, the Messiah, Eve, the Messiah who's in the background, who you don't even see. Remember, that person you see, he even rode on a donkey through the city.
Yeah.
All these are
Okay.
pictures. See, Eve is showing you that Eve was already redeemed, because remember, woman could not save man. It was always men thinking it was through man. They thought they were the head, not the woman. The woman was on a lower level at that time. So here's a woman.
Which is part of the curse.
Thank you. What they considered a curse. It wasn't.
No, and the curse in the garden that your desire will be for your husband, against your husband.
The Messiah specifically went to women on purpose. That's why he was doing that, because he was showing that women's role was not what men had set it up to be.
Right.
Yeah. I would like to hear more about this idea on
That's
Purim,
a good
because
story.
Esther actually functions as a messianic figure more than anybody else.
She's Eve.
She has the heart of Messiah,
That's right.
and she's willing to perish
Remember who
like
came
Messiah
to
was
it?
willing
The
to
one who
perish.
came to it is the Messiah. And talked to him for changing the name and doing what she did.
Maybe one of these, maybe I'm going to take a pause when Purim comes around next month on the Kingdom study, and I'm just going to devote one session to talking about Purim story, because I wrote a little article in an ebook on this, and I've done some digging about the story, and I love it so much, and I really want to actually draw the parallels between Esther and Yeshua.
Oh, wow.
They are superfluous. Okay, that's not the right word. They are plentiful, okay? That's a better word.
If you
They
want to,
really
I'll
are
help you.
abundant.
Because remember in that story, here's the one who was against the Jews. He died on a tree, and all those who were with him died on a tree. That's a picture of the end times.
Interesting. Wow, yeah. Yeah, the gal. Oh, interesting. Well,
How does it, I mean, you said it, Purim ties in with,
It's a picture
law.
it's showing you pictures of the characters in the Bible. See, when I learned how to read the Bible, I started studying, something came with there, 5 characters in the Torah that are important that you look to know who they are, so that when you read all the rest of it, it points to them throughout the stories. You see these repeated stories about Adam and Eve, Father and Son and Satan. And that's how I learned how to see all these stories, how they come, they're repeated stories.
So I'm confused on how Purim, I'm sorry, I didn't want to move on from this, but like, how does, like, the fall tie in with Purim?
Because it's a picture of when you read what most people don't understand, if you take all the feasts and line them up, they give a picture of the true who the Messiah really is, through these characters, through these events. But Purim is the last one on the calendar. So if you line up what happened at Purim, you see a picture of the end time when the man is sin, because Adam and Eve fell at the tree, the Messiah had to die on the tree.
That's really interesting.
He died at the exact time when Adam and Eve fell. That's why he said, I'm the second Adam.
so Jerry, can I put you down for 2 weeks? Are you going to be
I
here?
have no problem because I've got a couple of things I'm being pulled in.
All right. Can you email me and let me know?
Please.
We'll pray for you, Jerry.
Hey, if you can't do it in 2 weeks, you can do it in 4
I know,
weeks.
but it's a good story to show people a lot of parallels.
Okay.
Yeah, Jerry's on.
Yeah, we got him.
Yes? That's not what I heard from him. All right, you email me. How about that? Let's just leave it there. Okay, so let's move on. So before we actually dive into Matthew, which by the way, this is the book. There is, I failed to mention this, there is a free version, like just on the Gospel Coalition's.
Thanks.
Did I email that link? I emailed it to Charlie May because he asked, but
Of course he did.
I looked it up and I saw it. Like,
there is.
it's right there.
It's digital and it's PDF. I don't know if it's PDF or just on the website, but it's I think the same version of this. I didn't look too deeply.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, we're this book. I think it's mainly for you also in your own individual study. But I'm going to refer to it, sporadic. I'm not going to be completely tied to it, just to let you know. But anyway, this is for you as a reference. Don't cling to it. That's all I'm going to say about that, because I just want to let you know the Gospel Coalition, most people on there, they're not going to subscribe to the same eschatology that we have. Okay, and by that I mean theology about the latter days. They don't exactly have the same thinking about Israel's role that we have, and so there's going to be some disagreements there, and use this with wisdom. It's good material. They're excellent when it comes to Bible exposition and exegesis and stuff like that, and all that. But
This just seems like an answering book for something.
yeah, it's very interactive, which I like that. You can.
So there's not another book that you have to read that goes with this?
No, well, the book of Matthew.
No, I mean, some people have a book that they, for the instructors, so they can teach. And
Too many
this is for
books.
the
I prefer.
students.
Let's stick to the scriptures, and then
Yeah.
something supplemental is good enough. It's good enough. I don't want to overdo it because then it can
Alright.
become overwhelming. Okay, so of course, before we actually dive into the Gospel of Matthew and the account of Matthew, and even just the synoptic Gospels, because Matthew is one account of many accounts, and there's a lot of repeated stories and a lot of connections there. So before we dig into the actual text, we absolutely need to cover background, okay? Some background, especially leading up to the gospel accounts, to the days of Yeshua. And I just want to say that contrary to, how many of you have heard that the intertestamental period is 400 years of silence?
Mhm.
That's because most in the Christian world will describe it like that. That is absolutely not true. Well, you know, they say silence because there isn't like divine inspiration. There isn't a prophet that, you know, takes on the voice of God and that gives Israel information, that speaks to Israel in the same way. But it is not silent in so many different ways, okay? So contrary to that belief, the intertestamental period was actually a time in which kingdom and messianic expectations were boiling and bubbling over. Okay, they boomed, in fact. And it was the book of Daniel that really accelerated these expectations and the pictures and the associations that they made in their mind. So the book of Daniel really developed, and it also brings together a lot of these themes that we already just traced in the covenants. Okay? Well, we're not going to get into the book of Daniel. We're going to be touching upon it. And what I really want to do in these next few slides is go into some of these intertestamental literature. Okay?
Yeah.
So, anyway, before I get there,
Daniel's
let's...
from that time period? No.
No, Daniel's from the, you know, Babylonian exile. Okay, so we'll get to the map. I have a map coming up. So, okay. So the intertestamental period, during this time, like I said, the book of Daniel became the model, okay, the model book for kingdom and messianic expectations. And when I say messianic, I also mean kingdom, very interchangeable, because kingdom and messianic, Mashiach, right, are already associated there. So for one, why the book of Daniel? Well, for one, it reasserted God's universal and absolute kingship despite Israel's oppressed condition, okay? You kind of need something to hold on to like that when you're constantly being oppressed and taken captive by all these other nations, like Israel was, repeatedly. Secondly, though, it was the book of Daniel because the book of Daniel anticipated the day when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will crush all these other human kingdoms and bring them to an end. But this kingdom that God will set up will last forever. Okay, so actually I do want us to go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 2 if you have a Bible. We're going to spend some time there. And if you don't have a Bible, that's okay. You can just, we'll read these verses as well. But, so Daniel chapter 2 is where King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, right? And it scares him. And he brings in Daniel, and Daniel interprets that dream. Okay? And I'll just go ahead and read Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. In the time of those kings, I'm going to bring some context. I'm going to read this, and then we're going to talk about it more in the context, okay? So in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. What did we just talk about? Where else do we see the idea of an eternal kingdom in the scripture? We just talked about in the Davidic covenant, right? The idea of kingdom that brings good news to the whole world takes on an eternal nature to it. It's everlasting, forever. Okay, continue. So, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock. We're going to talk about this. This is already pulled out of the vision. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. And then going actually back up to Daniel chapter 2, verse 35. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, and the silver and the gold were all broken to pieces and became chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. The whole earth.
What verse are you in?
35. It's up on the screen too.
Yes, okay.
So this idea of the whole earth sounds familiar to us too, because this is the promise of the good news blessing for all the earth that we traced from Adam to Abraham, Moses, and David, right? All the families of the nation will be blessed. There will be a light to the nations. David says this instruction is for all mankind, and so on. So, Daniel chapter 2, just for context. Turn there. Okay, so starting in verse 31, Daniel is basically interpreting the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, okay? And King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of an image of this huge statue, okay? And I'm just going to start there, okay? You saw, O king, and behold, you saw, O king, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you. Its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was fine gold. Its chest and its arms were of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, okay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron and clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, kind of like an Adam, right? You are the head of gold. So King Nebuchadnezzar, his kingdom is the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom after that, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these other kingdoms. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, this fourth kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, and they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. Okay, verse 44. And in the days of those kings of the fourth kingdom, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hands, and that it broke to pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. So this is a very interesting, I think this is absolutely fascinating. I find it so fascinating how the history outlined here is symbolically prophesied. Ooh. Because if you know your biblical history, actually, after the time of Daniel, you can interpret these kingdoms, the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron, and partly clay. So Daniel said that Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, was the kingdom of gold, okay? But what kingdoms arose after Babylon? I don't know if it's my position.
Medio-Persia.
Yes. So you have the Medes and the Persians, really kind of acting as one almost there. I think they are that silver, right? The head, the chest and the arms, okay? They're the silver. And then after you have the Persian Empire, who conquers the Persians? Greece, okay? The bronze. Who conquers Greece? Rome. Iron-fisted Rome. They crushed everything in their path. They were strong as iron. Huh?
They made nice roads.
Yeah, absolutely. Gave citizenship. No, No, they did a lot of good things, but they were brutal. Brutal like iron, really. Iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things, and Rome truly was iron-fisted. So it says in verse 44, in the days of those kings, that fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, right? The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And as we know, it was during the Roman Empire that Yeshua, the King of Kings, arrived proclaiming what message? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come and is near. Okay? So Yeshua set up his eternal kingdom that will never be destroyed, as we saw in David, who the son of David, right, is coming and making good on the Davidic covenant and on Daniel's prophecy here, his vision. And Yeshua is that stone cut out by no human hand, okay? Also, he's known as the cornerstone, the builders rejected, and that stone struck all these other kingdoms, and that stone grew into a mountain, a great mountain that filled the whole earth. That filled the whole earth. That's already all these, that good news, that key promise of the good news, through that seed, right through that lineage of Abraham's seed and David's throne, that is, all of these are just coming together, okay? And just look how large that mountain has become since Yeshua's day into our day, right? Yeah, Linda.
Yes, well, speaking of kingdom, if we go through the Gospels, we see that the birth of Yeshua was surrounded by a lot of kingdom talk. Herod was concerned because the wise men came in and they said, we've seen the king, we've seen the king, and all about the kingdom coming that was going to overthrow something, because they had a sense that there was something that was going to overthrow the kingdom that was there.
Yeah. Well, and it's also interesting because the Roman Empire, the prophecy here is that that kingdom is a divided one. It's brittle because it's partly iron, partly clay. You know how the Roman Empire died and was taken? It wasn't through an outside force. It internally imploded because it was divided in itself.
It became woke.
Well,
I said it became woke.
that's all you're all right, no comment. But I love how, these, I don't know, just this coincides with history. It's so prophetic, and yeah.
So why did you say, you know who that was a picture of? That story you just read is the same one with David. David had 5 stones, which is the Torah. He used a stone to kill who?
Why?
Remember Goliath? They pointed to all the things that Goliath
thank you.
had.
Thank you.
The different kingdoms.
Yeah.
It was the same story.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't connect it with the stone that he crushed Goliath
You
with.
started something, I told you.
Good. But I also want us to, like that stone, it says here that stone, which was not by human hands, became a great mountain. Consider, just how far the gospel has spread into all the nations, right? And has become that great mountain, and how it's filling up the earth with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, like we saw prophesied in that Messianic prophecy in Habakkuk, right? Talked about that. So I just love that. And of course, the gospel still has some ways to go. But as Daniel ends the interpretation of his dream, you can be sure that the great God who has made known Daniel's vision of the future, certain and sure, the continual fulfillment will also be certain and sure in our days, in our future, as the gospel continues to fulfill the kingdom, right? And restore, bring in the fullness of the kingdom, because we are living, the kingdom has come, yes, but not fully. We know that, right? So anyways, I think, okay, so let me just share this last slide and then we'll pick up. So we're talking about how the book of Daniel was that model for the intertestamental period, because it talked about God's universal rule, right, during Israel's oppressed condition, but also it talked about this eternal kingdom that will rise up. But also, additionally, it spoke about God's agent and co-agent, who would be the heavenly Son of Man. This image is now introduced, to whom God, of course, would give over his dominion and his kingdom, okay? So Daniel says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. All these, the authority, the glory, the dominion, this started in the garden, right? This started the head-crushing seed of the woman, and redeeming for us that dominion, that rule. So we will talk more about this image, but basically this image of the Son of Man is during this time, the intertestamental time. It is a development of the promise of that seed, the offspring, and even more specifically, the dynasty promised to David. And we will see next week how the Son of Man actually gets associated during this time with the Son of David, and the profile of the image really comes together during this time period. And that is what sets up for us the book of Matthew, actually. It's the consolidation of the Old Covenant, Old Testament, all these themes and images during the intertestamental period. It's a consolidation of all that into the one person, Messiah, who is, right, the seed, the offspring, who has that dominion, who brings the eternal kingdom, who is the Son of David, who is the Son of Man, and all of that. So we will talk about all these vivid themes showing up in intertestamental literature, and we're going to get into some of that next week. We're going to talk about the book of Enoch and some midrash on eschatology. We're going to show some of that. We're going to talk about the Songs of Solomon, and yes, I will be qualifying the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, and I'll make sure to let you know it's not divinely inspired scripture, but we can still use it for good historical purposes and just to knowing what was on Jewish minds during that time period, and Jewish Messianic expectations during the Second Temple times, and then we'll get into more specific stuff. Okay.
Can you go back to the previous
Which,
one? Oh, the one after this one.
this one?
No, next to the last one.
Yeah, we'll talk about this. This is Second Temple period. This is the map I wanted to. Yeah, so the Second Temple times actually is about a span of 600 years. This is when the Second Temple was built, 515, right? Babylonian captivity was 586 BC, and then 70 years later, it was prophesied that it would be 70 years. The Second Temple is, rebuilt, and then Yeshua is born here around -4, and then it stops with the destruction of the Second Temple. So we'll get into what Jewish Messianic expectations were during this time, and more specifically toward the latter, actually, just before Yeshua was born. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was just noticing as we were going through Daniel that there's a great deal of Daniel 7 and it's 23 where it's talking about this kingdom with the 10 horns and everything, and then of course you see that echo in Revelation
Mm.
again about the
10 toes.
Antichrist, or,
Mm.
you know,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
gonna
Yeah,
change
just totally,
times and so forth. And it sort of comes together.
So let me go ahead and let you know, I am not an expert on apocryphal literature, meaning Daniel and Revelation. I'm not an expert. But if any of you want to take that theme and trace and compare the book of Daniel with Revelation and talk about that, like, I would be most happy to learn from you, because I'm only going to use the book of Daniel, and I'm not
Just
even
make
planning on getting to
suggestions.
Revelation, but yeah, no, like, I'm just gonna use it, insofar as it's applicable toward the background history of Second Temple times, just before, Yeshua is born, and the account that Matthew gives, what Matthew has in his mind, basically, so. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, yeah.
good Shabbos, and I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Not next week, but the following. And come ready, those of you who want to present. And if you can, email me if you have an estimate for like how long you might want to talk. That would be helpful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Turn this off.
Oh, yeah.